The will to power, as understood by Nietzsche, is by no means just the vulgar sort of striving for power, which finds expression in militarism and imperialism. Nietzsche was as sharp a critic of the Bismarck Empire as that empire produced. He had no admiration for that sort of thing at all, but descriptively found in that too, of course, an expression of a will to power, but he also found the will to power everywhere else. He found it in Christianity in a peculiar form. He thought, and he could quote St. Thomas Aquinas and any number of other great saints along these lines, that the Christian, having despaired of this world, hopes to go to heaven, and then from heaven behold the torments of his masters, of his enemies in hell. He too wants power, but having despaired of power in this world, seeks power in another world. The artist too seeks power. The philosopher too seeks power. We have here as comprehensive a monistic theory as we find in the early Freud, and a theory that might well be weighed in the balance against the dualism of the older Freud. Just as when Freud tried to supposedly explain everything in terms of sex, this meant that in fact he reinterpreted the traditional idea of sex, that what he finally meant by the sex impulse was something much less crude than what some other people had meant. So what Nietzsche means when he speaks of the will to power is also something just a little more subtle, something a little more polymorphic, something a little more protean, and just as Freud could hardly be said by an intelligent person to have endorsed or celebrated the sex impulse, so it is stupid, I think, to say of Nietzsche that he endorsed or celebrated the will to power. Another conception, psychological conception of Nietzsche's, which bears out what I've just said about the will to power, is the conception of sublimation. It was Nietzsche who first used that word sublimation in its contemporary sense, and his whole conception of the will to power, his whole psychology of the will to power depends on this idea of substitutions, that people again and again settle for what is second best, that when they can't get what they most want, then they will settle for brute power, for physical power, for cruelty, which isn't what they really want, but what is, in modern terminology, to be explained in terms of frustration. Nietzsche's key word here is the word resentment, and he finds resentment central in Christianity and finds resentment central in a great deal of traditional morality. And he initiates something for which Karl Jaspers coined a nice title in one of his early books, namely Psychology of Weltanschauungen, to look at Weltanschauungen and understand the psychological bases of them. Now what I might do, but definitely shall not do, at least in the lecture part, if you want to bring it out in discussion, all right, is deal specifically with Nietzsche on religion, to tie it up with last week's lecture, and with Nietzsche on morality, to tie it up with next week's lecture. The reason I will not do this is because I see no point in repeating in a lecture what I have written and published. So for those particularly interested in Nietzsche on religion, I may mention the chapter on Nietzsche's repudiation of Christ in my little book on Nietzsche. For those interested in Nietzsche and morality, the chapter already mentioned on how Nietzsche revolutionized morals in From Shakespeare to Existentialism. What I still want to say about Nietzsche's philosophy is that perhaps one can illuminate it by suggesting that there are three different types of philosophy encountered in Nietzsche. First of all, the traditional kind of philosophy, which I think in understanding Nietzsche is least important, though Heidegger, very perversely to my mind, stresses this and only this in his essay on Nietzsche, in his essay, not translated into English, on Nietzsche's word, God is dead. And this is the metaphysician in Nietzsche. He thinks that Heidegger thinks that Nietzsche was the last great metaphysician of the West. Plato perhaps the first, and Nietzsche the last. Well, there is some metaphysics in Nietzsche. The will to power does become, in the late Nietzsche, also, among other things, on top of everything else, a metaphysical hypothesis. He has to out Schopenhauer and say, Schopenhauer thought the ultimate reality was the will to live. No, it isn't that, it is the will to power. But I think this is a wholly marginal part of Nietzsche's philosophy. The two parts in Nietzsche's philosophy that are strong are, one, the analytic, and two, the existential. And this is what I have in mind when I think of Nietzsche as not himself a clear-cut existentialist, but as sort of the water-fed, the last great world historical philosopher in whom these two timeless tendencies are still very well fused. Well, in our time, there has been a dissociation of sensibility, and we have the analyst speaking English and the existentialist speaking German and French. Let me illustrate the analytic element in Nietzsche very briefly, and I will stress here particularly things that have to do with emphasis on language and grammar to link him with what's going on in analytic philosophy today. You find, for example, as analytic philosophy, his analyses of God, of the true world, of morality, of the good, of the four great errors, all in the twilight of the idols contained in the portable Nietzsche. You find them saying such things as, language talks of opposites, but there are only degrees and many refinements of gradation. He speaks of the misleading errors of language and the fundamental fallacies of reason which have become petrified in language, which understands and misunderstands all activity as due to an agent, a subject. Again, he says that when there is thinking, something must exist that does think is simply a formulation of our grammatical habits which couple all doing with a doer. There's plenty of this sort of thing in Nietzsche, which you might call anti-metaphysical and positivistic. But there is, of course, in Nietzsche also a great deal that links him with existentialism, and I'll just enumerate. His literary criticism, something in which Heidegger, Sartre, and Camus have also engaged in a big way. His psychological interests, his critique of Christianity and of Weltanschauungen generally. His analysis of nihilism and of different possible attitudes toward an absurd world, particularly relevant to the sort of thing that Sartre and Camus have done. His celebration that I've read to you of a new greatness of man, and his attempt to cross over from philosophy into literary attempts. It is therefore not surprising that Karl Jaspers should have written 2 books about Nietzsche, that Heidegger should have written an important essay about him, that Nietzsche's name should be the first name mentioned in Sartre's Being and Nothingness, and that Camus has written at length about him too. They're interested in him, they realize that in some sense he is one of theirs. It's high time for a conclusion, so that there will be time for some discussion. I've said that a philosopher probably should stand somewhere between literature, poetry on the one hand, and science on the other. And I think if one wants to criticize Nietzsche, one may well say that although this makes him readable and appealing and interesting, he stands a little too far in the direction of out-and-out literature, that there is too little in him of careful summing up, of taking together the different things he has said and himself comparing them instead of just leaving it to somebody else to do this, and seeing what stands up, what doesn't stand up, what has to be qualified. There is too little of that. There are many other criticisms that one can make of Nietzsche, just as in the case of Kierkegaard and of Sartre next week. I don't want to press all of these. One might just pick out one so that you see in what direction I might proceed. I think that occasionally he makes much too sharp a dichotomy between the higher man, the superior person, and the rest of mankind. But one would also have to say that if you read him thoroughly, you find him in other places trying to balance this. The whole fourth part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, for instance, makes fun of the higher man and makes the point quite literally that the higher men stink. I want to end on a positive note, and I will say in conclusion that for all his faults, I think there are exceedingly few philosophers or writers who equal Nietzsche in a fusion of three things: of scope, of which he has far more than almost any other philosopher. There's scarcely anything that might interest you intensely that he doesn't deal with. This in itself is no accomplishment. It might all be superficial for all that. So we have to take with this the second point he fuses with it, depth. Whatever he deals with, I think he goes, if not to the bottom of it, he goes very deep. He is very profound. He makes us see things we didn't see before. And then together with the scope and depth, which for all that might be tedious, might be a bore, except for people with a very strong intellectual stomach, he has also a great deal of passion, which makes him contagious, which is a good thing, which makes him inspire other people to be interested and to care strongly. And if you take him all in all, I do think, on reflection, the more I think about him, that he was one of the greatest philosophers and writers of all time. There are very few other philosophers that one can come back to again and again and read for pleasure.